Hi, and welcome to Lecture 5. We've got a lot to cover today, so I'm sort of going to jump right into it. This lecture is about the research methodology part of the research proposal. So I wanted to talk about that, show some forms that we're going to use to prepare to write Chapter 3 in our proposal, and then talk about how to write Chapter 3 and a whole bunch of other things too. So topics today: what's a methodology? We're going to cover the data collection worksheet. We're going to talk about data collection itself, different options for data collection, survey option, interview option, focus group option, record studies. These are all options for collecting data. Then we're going to talk about how to write Chapter 3, and we're going to review the elements of the template that I've been providing you, and we're going to look at Chapter 3 in particular. And a very quick comment at the end about a topic that students often get a little confused about organizational permission versus consent when you're using surveys. So we'll finish with that. So this is where we are in the process. We started out the semester by saying that research is a systematic process. It proceeds by first getting a topic, then writing a proposal. And that's what we're working on this semester, writing a proposal. But we'll end the semester talking about the rest of the process, which could be continued in one of our two capstone classes focuses on finishing the research. The other one does not. So if you take MSA600, you'll continue on and you'll actually ask MSA department for permission to collect data once your proposal is approved. You'll collect your data, you'll analyze it, and you'll write Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, and you'll add an executive summary. And instead of calling what you wrote in this class, which was a proposal, you'll call it a final research report. So anyway, that's the process. It's the process that all researchers use. And we're here to talk about the methodology today, which is Chapter 3 in a research proposal. So what is a methodology? Well, Chapter 3 and the methodology itself is really the second part of data collection. Because in Chapter 1, you ask questions. You say, these are the questions I really need to investigate. And then you go out and you review literature, and that's a great source of information that helps answer the questions. But it's not enough. It's not research. It's not research until you actually probe the actual group or issue under study and actually collect original or initial primary data, or maybe secondary data, but usually it's primary data about the issue or organization under study. So Chapter 3 is about the second part of data collection, because Chapter 2 is about collecting data from other studies. Chapter 3 is about doing your own study, really, collecting your own data. So in order to write Chapter 3, you really need to spend a little time thinking about things, and I'll talk about that. And you need to make Chapter 3 be driven from your research questions in Chapter 1, your sub-questions in particular. So we'll talk about that. I'll talk about a worksheet that you're going to use this semester to fill out in week 6. To prepare you to write Chapter 3 in week 7. So methodology, well, if we look at the purpose of a research proposal, it's to propose a problem and then to investigate it objectively without our biases, using data from two sources, literature or other studies, and data that we collect as part of our own study. So data comes from two sources. And based on the data we collect from other studies and our own study, we then can draw conclusions and answer our questions and make recommendations. So Chapter 3 methodology describes really your planned data collection effort. What data do I need to collect given those questions that I had? And how am I going to get that data? Where am I going to get it from? So really, what is a methodology? Because it's written in the future tense, kind of, it's really a plan. It's you're proposing. That's why we call this a research proposal. You're proposing to do something, and then you're giving this proposal to your research monitor, me in this class, or your research monitor in MSA600 if you take that option for your capstone, and they have to look at your plan and approve it. And if they approve it, then it's Katie bar the door, get out of the way, let me go get permission to collect data and collect my data and get done this class. And so I've seen students take the 699 capstone class and finish in 8 weeks instead of 16 because it's a fairly straightforward process. So therefore, because the methodology is a plan, it has to be detailed and specific and clear. It has to communicate the data that needs to be collected to answer all the research questions. You can't leave any out. It has to describe how the data is going to be collected, and then it has to suggest or propose once the data comes in, how it's going to be analyzed, and it has to inform readers of any specific limitations that they should be aware of. So the second topic is what we're going to focus on really in week 6. I'm going to ask you to fill out a data collection worksheet and submit it to me, so I can sort of look it over and sort of think about things. So we're going to talk about this data collection worksheet that you're going to fill out in week 6. And that's what I'll do now. And then we'll talk after we talk about what you're going to do in week 6, how to use what you do in week 6 to write your methodology chapter 3. So the subtitle here is Examining Research Questions and Thinking About How to Answer Them. And you'll see why I suggest that as a title here. So really, the chapter 3 and going and getting your data and know what data you have to collect is really not something you can do at the last minute. And so I can always tell when students wait to the very last minute to do their work in a given week and then have to get chapter 3 written. And there's a reflection they haven't spent enough time thinking about chapter 3. Because it does take a little bit of thought. It's just it's something that you got to kind of consider. So, you can see what it says here. You cannot just write your methodology. You have to think about it first. And that's a challenge, if you wait to the last minute, because there's no time for reflection. And therefore you're writing, but you're not thinking, and you haven't done the thinking. And sort of, that's a big differentiator between our A students and our not A students in this curriculum, which, the ones who spend a little more time planning and preparing for their work have more time to reflect on it, and they get the better grade. And that's particularly evident here in 600 and later in either one of the capstone classes. It's just, very evident. You sort of get what you pay for there, right? So, question, if I say you have to think about it, then your question to me should be, well, what do I got to think about? Just give me some ideas here. What you have to think about is each one of your research sub-questions. You got to look at each one and you got to say, wow, geez, look at that question. I want to know if personal factors are causing students not to finish the capstone, or whatever. It's one of your research questions. You got to think about it. So you say, well, what kind of data am I going to have to collect? And what does personal factors mean? And then you got to sort of dig into that, personal factors. Well, does it mean children? Does it mean, maybe moving around? What does it mean? What does personal factors mean? Or work factors, or relations with subordinates, or what do these things mean? So that's what we have to do. We have to go through each one of our research sub-questions and ask ourselves, what specific things do I have to ask when I do my survey or my interview about that question, that one question, to get it answered? Because the whole purpose here is to answer these research questions. And at the end of the day, if you do a great job answering your research questions factually, you've got an A paper. But if you don't, you don't. So if you don't do this, then, if you don't spend time thinking, problems occur. And one of the reasons I developed this worksheet, and one of the reasons I actually have enhanced the proposal template that's used by most 600 instructors, is because the students would just not be thorough. They would just not take enough time and consider all the sub-questions. And so some sub-questions would not get answered, or the data they were collecting wasn't the right data to answer the questions. And therefore you get to the end of the study and you don't have the data you need to come up with the results. So anyway, so the course really is structured here to allot time for thinking about the methodology, because I'm going to force you to spend 1 week thinking about it before you actually have to do it. I didn't used to do it this way. This is a fairly new approach. So what does it mean to think it through? Well, you can't just sit at the computer and write a methodology. It's a plan. It has to be constructed by thinking about what you're trying to do and how you're going to do it. So, I used to tell people to take out a pencil and paper, read your sub-questions, and write these things down. I don't do that anymore. I used to ask that question, and this is how I used to approach it, but I don't do that. And so now I really take a different approach, and I ask you to fill out this table, and you'll see it in a second. So we're really focused now on what data do I need. And it's a really hard thing, because students would always, and still, even today, even with the new design that I have on the in the template, they still do this, right? They get to the what data section of chapter 3, and they start writing about surveys and number of people they're going to give surveys to, which is how, it's not what. And so it's a big issue. So consideration really derives from the research questions. What data is needed, and then how's it going to be collected, from whom, what means, etc. But I want the what to be what and not how. And so it's a big deal to do this, because often when I ask students to describe the data they need, they're going to say they're going to give out a survey, they're going to survey 50 people, they're going to get surveys on Monday, get back Friday. And I said, well, that's all how. You haven't answered what data you're going to collect yet. Data is data, right? You're going to ask them, are you going to ask them whether they have children at home and how much time they have to spend with the children and how does that impact your school and yada, yada, yada. That's what. It's not how. It's what. So we need a means of contemplating what data we will need before considering how. I just wanted to pause for a second, and these typologies are in the Capstone student guide to the Capstone course, Capstone project. And so these kind of tell you what kind of data you need. If you know you're doing a program evaluation, and if you're looking at whether a program is effective or not, you need to know what the mission of the program is, and then you need performance data that tells you whether or not the mission is being accomplished. If you're looking at the efficiency of a program, you sort of need, well, what would be good, what's a standard, and then you need cost data and performance data, and how fast things are getting done, how much it's costing, and stuff. So this chart is useful in a way because it helps drive you towards what kind of data you would need if you were going to do one of these types of studies. So first you take your study and say, well, based on that problem I'm trying to solve, what is this? And I tell you, most of you are doing a program evaluation. Most of you are trying to see if the program's working right or not. It's an effectiveness study. So that's very often what most of you are trying to do. But let's put that aside for now. Let's talk about the data collection worksheet, right? So what's the worksheet going to do? We're going to identify the data. We need to answer each research question. After we get done that, we're going to figure out who the target audience is. What is the possible everyone who could be in this study? That's the target audience, right? That's the target. And then we're going to say, well, that's pretty big, and therefore I can't get to all the people in the target population. And therefore, I'm going to draw a representative sample, right? And then designing the survey or interview questions is all part of what you need to do, getting organizational permission and designing consent forms. So that's all what you need for Chapter 3, but let's focus now on this data collection worksheet. Okay, it looks just like this. You're going to be given access to it in week 6. You can go get it now if you want, but it's there. And this is actually the worksheet itself. The worksheet helps in the writing of Chapter 3. More importantly, completing it ensures you collect sufficient data to answer the research questions. If insufficient data is collected, then the research results are flawed and research integrity is compromised. In the following table, copy and paste each of your major and your sub-questions from Chapter 1 of the research proposal. Then complete the table. Discuss what data is necessary to answer each and the associated data collection sources and methods. The table currently contains an example of research questions related to why students have a difficult time completing a thesis or capstone class, such as this one, right? Or such as, not this one, but your capstone that you would take here at CMU. Do not include specific survey or interview questions in this table. You're not writing your survey. Your survey comes later. You're writing what kind of data you need and where you're going to get it from. So you'll be talking about your survey a little bit, but you're not writing survey questions here. Note that demographic data should only be included in here if you're going to use it. If you're asking them to tell whether they're male or female, then when you do your work, you've got to be saying males are different than females, or males are the same, or whatever. Females are different than males. So don't collect data you're not going to use, right? So now I know this is a little hard to see here, and that's okay because you're going to download this in week 6 and you get to look at it up close and personal. But if you look at the dark blue column, left-hand column, that's the research questions. 1. To what extent are personal factors in causing high turnover? 2. To what extent are work-related factors, right? So here's a couple of questions. Well, why isn't that question good enough? Why do I need to know more about what data? That's the data I want to collect. Well, because we don't know what personal factors really mean. And so you see in the second column, it says we're going to collect data about work and family, about marital status, about the number of children, about the family's extracurricular activities, that you take the kid to soccer every day. We're going to ask about family illnesses. We're also, because we're talking about personal things, we're not just asking about family and stuff. We're going to ask about behavioral things, personal motivation, attentiveness, procrastination, being punctual. So you see, I took that broad question that we had in Chapter 1 now, and I've really had to break it down into the real details. I really got to think this through. What do I have to ask about? Now, what's going to be driven out of column 2 is your survey, right? You're going to use that to come up with the questions for your survey. And then over in the right-hand column, it says, what data do I need? The right-hand column says, where am I going to get it from, right? And then it says over here, the number of students will be collected by contacting CMU's MSA department and requesting the information. Civilian, military, and age questions are included on the survey. See Appendix C, right? Survey includes specific questions about both work and family behavioral issues. Survey questions such as number of children, dependent status, and perception-based questions using a Likert scale are included. See Appendix C. So you can see what this table is all about. So this is the worksheet. You're going to use it when you get to week 6, and that's going by filling this out and me reviewing it for you. When you write your chapter 3, you should be in really good shape, because you're also going to have to design your survey or your interview questions and all that stuff. So you need this worksheet filled out. This is the worksheet continuation. What's the target population? That's everybody. You know, who's everybody? So like if we're doing a study about people finishing or not finishing the capstone class, who's the population? It's everybody who's ever taken the capstone class, right? Everybody, right? It could even be the instructors. So it's everybody. It's not people who haven't taken a capstone. They're not part of the population because they wouldn't know about this. So I mean, that's the kind of thing that we have to get into in terms of figuring out who the target population is. It's everybody who could be in there. And then once we've got that, we say, man, that's pretty big. You know, it's like I'm going to have to do a sample of that because it's just too big to do myself. And so we kind of look at it that way. 2, if you are not planning to survey or interview everybody, then what's your sample look like? And you can see a whole bunch of sub-questions here. What's my planned sample size? 100? Or is it everyone who ever completed or didn't complete the capstone in the last 2 years? You know, what's that sample look like? Expected return rate, sample structure. You're going to just randomly pull these names out of a hat? Are you just going to pick 50 yourself? A little bias there, right? And so you can sort of see what these questions are. So you have to fill out those questions. 3 characteristics of the data collection instrument that you plan to use, survey. And you can see questions there about the survey, specific procedures that will be followed to collect the data. Think through how the survey will be administered, and I give you a whole bunch of things to discuss. And then the time frame for the data collection effort, beginning and ending, right? Number 6, analyzing the collected data. Well, once you get the collected data in, how are you going to analyze it? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that a little bit this week, but more of that next week and the week after. And then what factors must be communicated to inform readers that the research might be less than perfect? These are your limitations, right? And you know, small sample size is an example. So I'll give you examples here for you to discuss. So that's the worksheet. You have to fill it out. I've given you a whole bunch of stuff to react to. And you're going to work on all that. And I'm going to give you feedback. And once you get that worksheet all done, you'll be ready to write Chapter 3. So quickly talking about writing Chapter 3, collecting primary or secondary data is what Chapter 3 is all about. And so you're going to have to, in your work this semester, you're going to have to write a survey, design a survey, or design your interview questions. Now, I can tell you at the back of the template, the proposal and final report template, are examples of surveys and interview questions. So don't be foolish and try to make one up. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say it that way. Don't decide that you're just going to have a series of questions and a very poor survey design. Use the survey that's at the back of this and change it around, right? Make it look nice is what I'm trying to say. Same with the interview questions. Just don't. I've had students who get a very low grade because they don't use the survey in the back. They just throw some questions out there, and they don't have the 1 to 5s in there and stuff, and the design of the survey is not good. So anyway, that's what you're going to have to do this semester. So, what else do I want to say about this collecting primary? In developing the chapter and writing Chapter 3, you're going to have to write detailed information about your approach for collecting your data. So writing your methodology, research methodology purpose is to convince the instructor that you know what remains to be done, what you're going to do. And the instructor has to have confidence that you have done enough detail and you know when and where and how you're going to get this done. So that's the idea here. Things that we have to discuss. I've already mentioned a lot of this in the worksheet. Time frame for data collection, whether using survey or interview or observation, how data collection instruments will be distributed and collected. My cat wants to come into this room, so I've got the door closed, and he's meowing outside the door. And so I paused this just to let the cat in. Anyway, in the proposal template, all the things you see on this slide are discussed, and you're asked to write about these things using the proposal template. So don't ignore them. They're all necessary. Let's see what else. Okay, this is actually the template itself. You can sort of see two things. One is sort of like the main text, where I discuss what you should write in different paragraphs and places. The other thing is the comments out on the right-hand side, which is start new chapters on a new page, no personal pronouns ever in a research report ever, any place. What else do I have here? When writing your final report, change this from future tense to past tense. Little things, right? So I have little things on the right-hand side as comments, but then within the paragraphs I tell you what to write, right? So include an explanation of your approach, program evaluation, and so you can sort of see what goes. So the template is just so useful for you because you can really fill it out. Now notice here's in Chapter 3, this table is here, Table 3.1. I have students asking me this past couple weeks, do we have to include Chapter 3.1 in Chapter 3? Yes, and guess where you get that from, right? Your worksheet. It's the same thing. It's the same table, right? But yes, it must be included in your chapter. Why? Because if you decide, we'll talk at the end of the semester about the two different capstones, but if you decide to take 699 and finish up whatever you start in this class, or you start a new proposal, but you want to do research instead of doing 5 papers, then the person who gets this proposal won't be me. I'm not allowed to teach 699 because I teach 600, and we're just not allowed to teach both. So that instructor will see this table, and they'll say, man, this is very, very thoughtful consideration of what data you need to collect. So yes, you have to have this table in Chapter 3 this semester. If you don't put it in there, I'm going to tell you, put it in, right? So you're not getting out of this class with a good grade without that table being there. So don't waste my time and your time. Put it in. And guess what? It's coming from, in week 6, you're going to write fill out your form. And then in week 7, you're going to write your chapter. So in week 6, you're going to have this kind of approved by me, right? So then in week 7, you can just use the stuff that you put in there. So anyway, that's the format. These are just notes about, enhance what I have already in the template. It says when you describe your methodology, your hows, give as much detail as possible. Where's the research going to be conducted? What are the characteristics of the subjects? And again, in both the application you fill out in week 6 and in the template, it asks you to do all this stuff anyway, stating that the survey will be anonymous, because we'll get into this, but you don't want to harm your respondents, especially like if it's in the workplace or something. And so you really want the stuff that's coming back to really be unvarnished, and you want it to be, people that spill their guts, and the best way they do that is when their name's not attached to something. So that's important. So you can see in the template here, there's more comments on the right-hand side, but it's data collection procedures, who's the target population, what's the sample details, instrumentation, survey is going to be used. A lot of people for some reason, they like to keep saying questionnaire. And we're not using questionnaires. I mean, I guess that's a synonym, but we're going to use the word survey. And also, if you only have one survey, don't say the questionnaires will be given out. Things are, it's only one survey. And so when you're writing this, just say the survey will do this, not surveys. It's another common problem I've been running into lately. And so you can see down here on this page, begins to talk about the procedures. It says describe the research procedures in detail, indicate if the survey will be anonymous or not. The surveys are returned by email. They're not anonymous. Describe the researcher relationship to the respondents. Why? Because if you're the supervisor of people you're giving out surveys to, there's a chance that you could retaliate. You could figure out who filled out what survey and retaliate. So it's a little bit more challenging if you're the supervisor to be surveying your subordinates. And we can still do it, but it takes a little bit more work. So procedures, describe the procedures in detail, indicate if a survey will be conducted using paper or whether you're going to use SurveyMonkey or whatever. So you can see the template just really lays it out. You just got to change this into what you were planning to do as opposed to all my words, right? So change it. And then the methodological limitations. This is a note here. Analyzing the data, how the data is going to be analyzed is talked about in Chapter 3. And in reality, for most of you, what you're going to do is you're going to have a survey, and it's going to be using Likert scaled questions, at least some of them. And Likert scales 1 to 5. And so once you get surveys back, a whole bunch of surveys with 1 to 5 scores on them, you can take all the surveys and you can do what's the average score for question number 1, and what's the standard deviation for question number 1. We'll cover this in coming weeks, right? So most of you are going to be using descriptive statistics. Very few of you are going to be using inferential statistics. You're not going to use t-tests or regression analyses. Most of you are not. If you're doing a feasibility study, you're going to be doing financial analysis, cash flow, break-even analysis, payback period. So if you decide to do a feasibility, well, look, it's really easy. I'm going to write a proposal on how to open up a pet shop, because that's easy, right? Well, no, it's not easy, because it's a financial analysis, and you have to have a lot of information in this chapter about how you're going to build a cash flow model, how you're going to conduct your break-even analysis, where you're going to get quality data from, what your sources of capital are likely to be, and what your payback period is likely to be. So deciding to do a feasibility study because it's easy is not wise. Giving out surveys seems to me to be easier. But if that's what you want to do, that's fine, and we'll get it done. So those are all kinds of things about analyzing the data that you can discuss, because you're required in Chapter 3 to discuss how you're going to analyze the data when it comes back in. And so I'm going to skip this data analysis discussion because we're going to get into that a lot in the next 2 weeks. So limitations is the final part of Chapter 3, and it's essential that you self-disclose any vulnerabilities. If you don't do that, your credibility is destroyed, right? If you try to put this off as best research and you don't self-disclose the weaknesses, other people will. It's what we do. In research, researchers eat each other. They just look, Kessler's research really is terrible because he didn't disclose it. He was using a survey that wasn't valid and reliable. That's what people do. So you have to self-disclose all the weaknesses, right? A small sample size. I'm telling y'all in this part of my Chapter 3, my survey, I made it up, so didn't have time. I didn't test it for validity and reliability. I picked a convenient sample. I didn't do it random. And therefore, because of that, my sample may not accurately reflect the population. I'll talk about these things a little bit more in other lectures. So that's the last part of what you have to write about in Chapter 3. And this is just a clip from the template. And then you're going to have appendices as well at the end of week 7. You're going to have, if you're going to use a survey, you're going to have your survey, and then you're going to have what's called a consent form. And when you hand out a survey, you have to hand somebody a consent form that explains to them that they don't have to do the survey unless they want to, and that's going to be anonymous. I'm going to give you examples to use of the consent forms. We're going to get those from the capstone guide, which we'll talk about later. So you'll have examples to use of everything. Also, permission letter from the organization to do the study. No one in this class can do a study in an organization without the organization giving written permission to do the study. So we need those permission letters too. You don't need the permission signed this semester, but if you could get it signed, it'd be great if you plan on finishing your study and doing a study for your capstone. We'll talk about that later too. Okay, so this is just an example of the survey. It's a nice looking survey. It's the appendix to the template. You can use it. This is the interview format that's in the template. You can use that as well. And so finally, what do we want to say about Chapter 3 in summary? Your methodology really is essential, right? It's telling how you're going to do your second data collection effort. You've done the literature. Now you're going to collect data, right? It's your plan. How does it communicate in detail what type of study you're doing, what data you need to answer your research questions, what procedures you're going to follow to get that data, how you're going to analyze the data once it comes in, how you think you're going to analyze it anyway. You can change your mind later, right? And any limitations to the studies so that readers are aware that you have disclosed any limitations and they don't have to go picking at your work to find limitations themselves. Okay, just a few slides here. I want to talk about designing surveys and I want to talk about conducting interviews very briefly. Surveys are considered descriptive research, which we're going to talk about next week. They ask questions about perceptions, what's happening and why. I mean, they're not 100%. If I ask someone their opinion on whether or not the supervisor is a good supervisor, that's an opinion, right? It's not a clear, objective measure that the supervisor is good or bad. It's just a person's opinion. And so that's why we call this descriptive research, where it's usually perception based. But we still turn it into quantitative by doing Likert, right, to 1 to 5. So let's talk about surveys, and surveys being descriptive research. When we design a survey, what should be asked? Well, that's prepped in that table 3.1, right? It's in the worksheet that you're going to do in week 6, and it's in your table 3.1 in week 7. So you have to ask the stuff that you put in those tables in your survey. If you don't, you got a gap here, right? You got a problem. How should each question be phrased, and what sequence should it be structured, etc. So, if you were taking a course on survey design, you'd be spending hours on all that stuff, right? So this is my advice, right? Keep the surveys reasonably short, 8 to 15 questions. You get beyond 15 questions, people don't want to take the survey, and you get a lower return rate. So, keep it modest, right? And then don't ask somebody, what's your age? Say is your age 0 to 20, 21 to 40. Do bracketing, right? And then use Likert scale for lots of questions, 1 to 5, because you can do descriptive statistics, right? You can say, oh, then this question number 3, use Likert scale 1 to 5, and the average score was 3.8, right? Standard deviation was 1.1 or whatever, right? And then also on every survey this semester, if you don't do this, you get some feedback from me. You have to have at least one open-ended question. What other factors do you think could be causing the problem? It's just like that, right? It's not going to vary from that very much. What other factors do you think? Because you're in your survey, you're asking specific questions, but what if you missed it, right? So you need the catch-all at the end. That open-ended question. What else could it be? Don't collect data you're not going to analyze. I mean, if you're not going to analyze the data, breaking people into age groups, then don't ask for age. Don't ask, if you're not going to do gender analysis, don't ask for gender. Don't ask for data that you're not going to use. Also, and this is really important, test your survey with a small group of people. Take it home and give it to your daughter and your son and your uncle and your grandmother, and see what they think of your survey. They'll give you, I don't know what this question means. And you're like, oh, I thought it was clear. And like, no, I don't know what it means. So test your surveys. Pre-testing and revising, try it out in a group, convenience group, people at home. It helps you identify difficulties, that they don't understand the questions, or the questions are ambiguous, or the questions are biased. It helps you determine whether the format's good and the questions flow, and questions can be answered, and yada, yada, yada. Interviewing. If you decide to do interviews, and a lot of times, I always say best kind of research you can do is give out surveys and then do some interviews as well, right? So maybe you give out the surveys to the employees and then you interview the director of HR. So I love studies where you're doing both, right? So interviewing is just as important. It can be just as beneficial. Okay, so that's called fieldwork. For interviews or focus groups, you have to figure out who you're going to interview and why. And you have to, like in Chapter 3, you'd have to write, I'm going to interview the director of HR because director of HR is in a good position, da-da-da-da. So you need to select participants, right? And if you're only going to do interviews and you're not doing a survey, then you need to have a representative sample, right? And so you need to make sure you get one of these kind, one of those kind, one of these kind. And then you contact and you invite to participate. You prep your interview and focus group questions. And in this class, you have to prep those for the proposal. We won't let you do an interview unless you get it done and get it approved. And you can inquire about a lot of things. And interviews are very powerful because you can ask very specific questions. You can ask 1 to 5 questions. It's like, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you think how screwed up do you think this organization is? And they say, well, it's with 5 is very screwed up. It's 5. And you say, well, why do you answer 5? And they explain that. You can't do that on a survey. Well, you can. You can say, excuse me, on a scale of 1 to 5, what do you think it is? And then explain your answer. So you can do it on a survey. But it's a lot easier because when you're in an interview, they can say something and that prompts you to ask something else. And so you still have that and that give and take. And then don't forget, even in an interview, to use open-ended questions. Any other ideas you have about why things are so bad, why morale's low or people are leaving or whatever. Don't make it too long. Feel free to do telephone interview, but telephone interviews shouldn't be more than maybe 10 or 15 minutes unless it goes on and on and on. But you should tell them you need 10 minutes of their time or 15 minutes of their time when you schedule it. In terms of consent, we'll get into this later, but there's if you're doing a telephonic interview, you read a little bit at the beginning that we'll talk about later, and you say to them, do you agree to participate in the interview, and they say they do, that's consent, right? So you do the interview. If it's face-to-face, CMU has a form. We ask them to sign a form, read and sign a form that says, you won't disclose their identity, you won't use this against them in a bad way, and it says a bunch of things. You have to get them to sign that one. So telephone is called implicit consent. Face-to-face, they have to sign something. And so issues, anonymity, they still may be reluctant. You can say, I promise you none of this information will be attributed to you. But if your only interviews with the director of HR and it says that in your study, there's not going to be any anonymity because there's only one director of HR, right? And also you have to remember in interviews that, human memory, people trying to remember something that occurred in the past, memories are just not great. The other option is to do for data other than survey or interview is a record study, right? So you can go through personnel records, right? It's a little tricky to get permission to go through those. Your HR director's got to say it's okay for you to go through that, but do not disclose identities, right? So if you're going through and looking at longevity, how long people have been employed or whatever, you're going through record by record by record. Student records, patient records, but again, you have to be very careful about disclosing data out of these record systems of records. You can study published data, but you can't study data from other studies. If you try to present data from other studies as your data, that belongs in Chapter 2, not Chapter 4. So, but if you go out and get to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or you go to the Labor Department's stats group and you get economic data for the last 50 years, that's secondary data. But you're not using it from another study. You're using the original data, but it's secondary because it's census data or economic data or financial data. Remember, you can't do a double literature review. I have failed students in the past as a second reviewer in a capstone class because they come in and they try to pass off data from other studies as data, and it's not. It's literature. Okay, recognize, finally, it's my last topic, and then I'll shut up. This is a very confusing issue. There's two kinds of consent permission forms, right? One is called the consent form. It's a form that goes on the front of the survey and says your data will be kept, your identities will not be disclosed, all data is anonymous. Please fill out the survey and return it to me by Thursday. That's called the consent form. That's a consent to participate in the study. It's very different than another form we have, which is the organization saying, I approve you're conducting this study in our organization. Signed, Jane Jones. Right, so there's an organizational permission to conduct a study, which you must have. No one will do studies here without a permission letter, right? Versus a consent form, which goes on each survey or is giving out with each interview. That's a consent form. That's a consent by the participants whom you're collecting data from. It's different than the organizational permission letter. So I'm going to stop there. There's a little bit more detail here, but it just says what I just said. So remember, consent forms are given out with data collection effort. Permission letter is permission to conduct this study by the organization, which you only need one letter. Once it gets signed, it's good for up to a year. So that's why if you were planning to take your capstone later, and you really wanted to finish up whatever we do in this semester, it'd be a great idea to get that signed permission letter now, and it's good for a year. So as long as you're taking your capstone, fairly soon, that would be great. So anyway, I've talked about a lot of things. I'm going to still continue with methodology over the next 2 weeks. We're going to talk about quantitative and qualitative data over the next 2 weeks. And so we're going to dig into surveys and other kinds of data and how to analyze that data in particular, because that's consistent with our Leady text. And so I didn't want to deviate too much from Leady text. So anyway, that's it. This is the end of the methodology. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I know we covered a lot. Week 6, you'll fill out the data collection application, which I'll review, and then week 7, you'll write chapter 3, you'll add your consent forms and your data collection instruments in draft. I'll give you feedback, and then you'll turn in your whole proposal at the end of week 8 for a final grade. So, end of today's discussion. I'll see you in the